Thank you everyone for joining us today for our monthly Lunch and Learn. I want to introduce our kind host, Eric K. Washington. He is a member of the city's Archives, Reference, and Research Advisory Board, the ARRAB committee. He's an independent historian and author. In 2018, he initiated the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission's still ongoing review process of the former schoolhouse. He also prominently featured the school in his 2019 biography of one of its graduates, Boss of the Grips, The Life of James H. Williams and the Red Caps of Grand Central Terminal, winner of the Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship of New York History. Okay, thank you. Without further ado, take it away, Eric.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Eric K. Washington. I want to start first by thanking Commissioner Toole of Department of Records and Information Services, Municipal Archives, for inviting me to talk about former colored school number 4. I first became aware of this schoolhouse while researching a biography of one of its graduates. And in November 2018, I appealed to the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission to consider it as the building for designation. And the Municipal Archives resources were invaluable to me, from the 1940 tax photos, prove that the building that I see today when I go to shop at the Housing Works thrift shop across the street was indeed one and the same, to Board of Education records that tell me who worked there, even in some instances how much they made, and in some instances who lived there, and to vital records such as birth, death, and marriage certificates that helped me to put the school in the broader context in relation to the surrounding neighborhood. So I appreciate your invitation to share some of the information that I've gleaned about this site from the wealth of these public resources. So, as a New Yorker, as a Black New Yorker, as a licensed New York City tour guide, I know there are woefully too few extant properties that reflect the complex historical trajectory and milestones and breadth of our great city's African-American experience. But I also know that unlikely doorways often reveal essential but forgotten stories, as demonstrated by some of the many people and events you're about to meet that have passed through the doors of the former colored school number 4 schoolhouse. For 34 years, from 1860 to 1894, the 3-story building at 128 West 17th Street embodied New York City's official racial caste education system that spanned most of the 19th century. Successively known as Colored School number 7, Colored School number 4, and Grammar School number 81, the old schoolhouse duly served the numerous working class African-American families that were once concentrated in Chelsea's West Side blocks, in what was then part of the city's dubious Tenderloin precinct, during the Civil War, the postbellum Reconstruction era, and the ensuing decades of New York's gritty bordered Gilded Age. Colored School number 4 was integral to an informal plexus of other African-American schools, churches, enterprises, missions, and societies that gave anchor to Lower Manhattan's growing Black enclaves as they drifted upwards to West Side neighborhoods like Hell's Kitchen and San Juan Hill. Indeed, this late 19th century school graduated the progenitors of myriad citizen leaders who effectively made the community of Harlem, even farther uptown, the renowned 20th century capital of Black America. To my knowledge, this 17th Street building represents Manhattan's only surviving colored schoolhouse, and possibly the borough's oldest extant public education facility as well. But how did it come about? Historically, this was one of a series of schoolhouses that evolved from the African free school system, which you see on the left, established in 1787 by the New York Manumission Society to educate Black children at the beginning of what became a protracted process of gradually abolishing race-based slavery statewide. The structure is a rare example of the model primary schoolhouse designed in 1843 and adopted the next year by the Public School Society as an efficient plan. However, it was probably not built before 1853, 10 years later, when that society merged with the Board of Education. The sketch depicts an identical facade to the present building at 128 West 17th Street. Give or take some variations, the dispersed schoolhouses basically followed the prescribed exterior and interior plans, which Colored School Number 4 also mirrored. Here, compared to the 1853 rendering of the 1843 design on the left, is how the old schoolhouse appeared in 1908, the two top black and white pictures. 1940, the Municipal Archives tax photos, bottom center. And about 2 weeks ago that I took. From at least 1853, the little building housed several variously numbered primary schools by the address of 98 West 17th Street. This ended in September 1860, when the Board of Ed elevated the former Colored Primary School Number 1, which was located nearby in the basement of the African Union Methodist Church on 15th Street, by merging it with a new ward grammar school at the 17th Street Schoolhouse. This would be called Colored School Number 7 under Principal Charlotte S. Smith. In addition to the new Colored Ward School Number 7's day school for children was an evening school for adults. Just before Christmas of 1860, a guest attending the close of the first term of the evening school wrote that the schoolhouse was filled to its utmost capacity, there being not less than 500 present, to witness members of the night school. So large a number of grown persons, some 60 and 70 years of age, received their certificates of regular attendance. A measure of the reception's significance might be weighed by the participation of Reverend Dr. James W.C. Pennington, who you see the upper left corner, the Brooklyn-based minister, orator, writer, educator, and abolitionist of international renown, who came to say the benedictions. Ultimately, however, the school's driving spirit was its redoubtable principal, Sarah J.S. Tompkins. On April 30th, 1863, as the Civil War raged, Tompkins' 31-year tenure began as she was appointed to replace Charlotte Smith, the recently deceased principal of Colored School Number 7. Tompkins had to show her mettle within her very first months. On July 14th, 1863, a crowd of unruly whites spilled into West 17th Street during New York's infamous draft riots. Just the day before, such a rabble had attacked the Colored Orphan Asylum up on Fifth Avenue and 43rd Street, irrespective of the children inside, whom the staff had fortunately ushered through a back door to safety, and burnt the orphanage to the ground. A newspaper description suggests that Tompkins now faced a potentially similar scene of terror. The mob congregated in front while the school was in session. It seems that two colored women whom they had pursued had taken refuge in the school building, and they were determined to get at them. The teachers promptly barred all the doors leading to the street, and the rioters, after a few ineffectual efforts to break in, turned their attention to a little wooden shanty on the opposite side of the street. Those draft riots of 1863 amounted to 5 days of carnage and murder. The school emerged unscathed, but emotional scars were surely palpable months later, when newspapers reported a Thanksgiving festival of the colored children of Ward School Number 7, under the charge of Mrs. Tompkins, in gratitude for their escape from death during the late riots. By the following spring, the unrest on 17th Street had ended, but just a few blocks east of the schoolhouse, the street was a scene of bustling activity that captivated the pupils. Set up along the 17th Street side of Union Square, the Metropolitan Sanitary Fair of 1864 was a monumental civic festival to aid the Union Army's sick and wounded. Tompkins notably engaged the school in the city's major war relief effort, albeit off-site. Farther down at Shiloh Presbyterian Church on Prince Street, which was then under Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, the renowned abolitionist, educator, and later statesman, Colored School Number 7 gave a musical and dramatic benefit in aid of the soldiers. No doubt for the newly formed 20th U.S. Colored Infantry in particular, who ceremoniously received their colors in front of the Union League Club on 17th Street, just across from Union Square. Soon afterwards, Reverend Garnett himself a graduate of New York's African Free School, left for a new ministry in Washington, then a presidency of Avery College in Pittsburgh, where his wife died in 1870. Returning to New York, he inevitably reconnected with Tompkins, who was ever a community activist throughout her tenure. In March 1871, Tompkins initiated a series of public lectures in the schoolhouse, by now renamed from Colored School Number 7 to Colored School Number 4. The first speaker was the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, whom Sarah Tompkins married 4 years later in 1875, becoming ever after Sarah Garnett. I just want to pause here. This is a copy of the marriage certificate between Henry Highland Garnett and Sarah Tompkins that I was only recently able to find because the Municipal Archives has just made virtual its vital records of birth certificates and marriage certificates. So a lot of sources would say they were married in 1879, and it's repeated over and over and over again. And there was the documentation that showed that it was actually 1875. And I don't know if you can make out on the screen, but the minister who presided, it says A.N. Freeman, happened to be someone who I knew, Amos Noe Freeman, who was one of the more prominent Black abolitionists of the 19th century. So it's a testament to who their friends were and who they associated with, the fact that Freeman was the one who performed the ceremony. Besides Henry Highland Garnett, other notable visitors associated with the school included Lieutenant Governor Oscar James Dunn of Louisiana. In 1869, he visited. So this was during the Reconstruction period, when there were indeed Black politicians, in the Congress, and he was for a short period, but nevertheless, in fact, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Louisiana. Henry O. Flipper, who was a West Point cadet when he visited the school in 1875, and he would become West Point's first Black graduate. Sir James Bain, Lord Provost of Glasgow, who visited in 1876, the centennial year, and he was escorted to the school by the mayor of New York City. And J.A. Arnault, who was a Black Shakespearean actor. He had his own company of Black actors called the Astor Place Tragedy Company, it was associated with benefits for the school. Newspapers also cited the school's engagement during notable events, including presidential inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant, the memorial to U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, a memorial to U.S. President James A. Garfield, who was the one who appointed Reverend Garnett to be minister to Liberia. And at that memorial, Sarah Garnett's own daughter was the organist, Serena Garnett, who I was only able, again, thanks to the records that are now available online, to find her death certificate. And the onstage participation in Louise A. Smith's The Little Mountain Fairies at Chickering Hall. By the early 1880s, the state legislature was poised to let the Board of Education absorb its handful of Jim Crow colored schools into the general system. These schools were admittedly sad relics of the slavery era, and yet the diligence of Black educators had bestowed them with a distinct pride of place in the African-American communities that they served. Maybe it's telling that in 1887, Tompkins's pupils were celebrating the anniversary of the 15th Amendment, a law peculiar to Black interests insofar as it guaranteed voting rights, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Almost 2 decades since that law's passage in 1870. At any rate, the proposed closure of these schools galvanized Sarah Garnett and others to a mass protest. Reportedly, encouraged by a letter from Frederick Douglass, they implored the Board of Ed either to retain Black teachers as equals with white teachers or else to leave the colored schools as they were. Ultimately, in 1884, a legislative act signed by New York State Governor Grover Cleveland spared just 2 of the separate race-based schools. One of them was called Number 4, thereafter designated Grammar School Number 1. But 10 years later, upon determining it to be no longer required for school purposes, the Board of Education resolved in 1894 to sell the building, which it obviously never did. For her part, Sarah Garnett remained an activist, educator, community leader, and suffragist. In 1895, she co-founded an association to build a community hospital. Later, in her native Brooklyn, she and her sister, Susan McKinney Stewart, the state's first Black woman to earn a medical degree, founded the Equal Suffrage League, which in 1908 joined with the National Association of Colored Women to petition the US Congress for women's right to vote. At her memorial in 1911, personal testimonials were heard from her active allies, such as civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois and journalist Ida B. Wells. And this was commensurate with the high reputation that Garnett had built at Colored School Number 4. By the time the school closed in 1894, Garnett's diligent core of African-American teachers had long made it a singular pillar of the Black community. The school's other remarkable teachers included J. Imogen Howard. In 1868, Bostonian Howard joined the teaching staff at Colored School Number 4. She was an award-winning essayist and also a musical prodigy. In 1893, New York's Governor Roswell Flower appointed her to represent the state at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. She was the only Black manager at the World's Fair. In 1900, she's the only Black winner of the Evening Telegram newspaper's Great Teachers Competition, who was sent to the Paris Exposition. William Appo is one of the most vivid teachers that I've come up with at the school. His life is so varied, and I can't find an image of him at all. So he's very colorful, but just sort of a brief synopsis is that he joined the school in 1865. He was one of the most influential African-American musicians and music educators of the century. He started out with the legendary Black maestro Francis Johnson in Philadelphia, with whom he toured England in 1837 and purportedly performed before Queen Victoria. Appo was aligned to white abolitionists Gerrit Smith and John Brown, and to Black suffrage activists in upstate New York near Lake Placid. Appo's daughter, Helen Appo Cook, who was a noted suffragist in Washington, D.C., when she lived in New York, she taught at one of the other colored schools, Colored School Number 6. And her story kind of typifies, what were the odds, part of the context of the school that, its reason for being and reason for struggling to be a top-notch school. She went through the normal rigors of education at the normal college, graduated in 1857 with another notable teacher, Elizabeth Graham. Some of you may have heard of her as the Rosa Parks of New York about a century before. She had a landmark court case where she'd been thrown off a streetcar and she sued and won the case, which on paper resulted in the desegregation of public conveyances in New York. Not actually, but at least on paper. But she and Helen Appo graduated in 1857. There was a huge graduation ceremony at the Academy of Music on 14th Street, but the two of them, who were the only Black students, were not allowed to be part of the celebration. So they were handed their diploma off stage. So that was rather typical of the times. Susan Elizabeth Frazier, who descended from New York's ancestors who fought in the American Revolution and grew up on 17th Street on the very same block as the school, where she graduated in 1882. In 1895, Frazier's landmark lawsuit resulted in her becoming New York City's first Black teacher assigned to a mixed public school. In 1911, she spearheaded a call to action of women's clubs to care for the aged and indigent Harriet Tubman. And during World War I, Frazier was president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Old 15th National Guard, otherwise known as it was the African-American troop best known as the 369th Harlem Hellfighters Regiment. She was purportedly the first Black woman to be buried with full military honors. And in 1919, the Evening Telegram newspaper again had a teachers competition, and it was based on public votes. And Frazier was sent on a teacher's delegation to the recently hushed European battlefields. There were notable graduates who included Walter F. Craig, who was a musical prodigy, hailed as the representative colored violin soloist and musical director of the race. In 1861, his family had moved to the city and enrolled him in Colored School Number 7, as it was then, at 98 West 17th Street. By the time he graduated, the school had become Colored School number 4, and the address had changed to 128 West 17th Street. In 1870, he debuted as a violin soloist at Cooper Union and formed his own Craig's Orchestra in 1872. In 1885, he conducted a German orchestra, which performed for a Black Society Ball at Madison Square Garden. In about 1886, he was the first Black conductor admitted to the all-white Musical Mutual Protective Union. Craig's famous orchestra was one of the preeminent late 19th, early 20th century society orchestras for Black and white audiences alike. And perhaps closest to my heart is the eponymous subject of my biography, Boss of the Grips, the life of James H. Williams and the Red Caps of Grand Central Terminal, which is how I became aware of the school. As the Grand Central's station chief Red Cap attendant for nearly half a century, Williams presided over the essential Harlem-based workforce that produced the city's first Black police officer, Jesse Battle, Columbia University's first Black architecture school graduate, and such familiar names today as Paul Robeson, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. So the former Colored School number 4 opens, I think, a singular window on the African-American narrative of New York City's history. It's very heartening that just a few years ago, an unrelated Brooklyn public school was renamed in the honor of Sarah J. Garnett, and that currently Manhattan's PS 11 is also renaming itself the Sarah J. Garnett School. I really believe that justice dictates that we preserve this rare heritage site and the last surviving colored schoolhouse in Manhattan and honor its impressive lives that filled its rooms. I think its protection is really vital to those stories that wove in and out of its story. And I'm happy to take any questions. And I thank you again for inviting me to share this information with you.
So we have a number of questions on the chat.
Great.
If you have any more, please continue to add them. I will get started. Make sure I don't want to miss anyone. Okay, Karen asks, do you know what kind of curriculum the school offered?
No, but that's a great question. I mean, it would have been the usual curriculum. The teachers had the same training requirements as white teachers, but the schools were segregated. So all the basic curriculums would have been the same in the colored schools as they were in the general schools, in the white schools. However, one of the things I mentioned, there were certain things that happened certainly at colored school number 4, and I think this was probably typical of the other colored schools, where they celebrated the passing of the 15th Amendment, for 20 years after it was passed. These memorials where Sarah Garnett made sure that her school participated in memorials for people who were friendly to the race, like Ulysses S. Grant, like Charles Sumner. So all of these sort of add-ons to the curriculum were part of the curriculum. I'd be dying to know what, say, William Appo, the music teacher, taught, because he had all of this background experience. He didn't come out of the same route of the normal schools, as they were called, the teachers training schools, but he had all of this practical musical experience because he was a professional musician. And he lived through different eras of musical tastes and sensibilities. So I think that must have contributed to, the syllabuses that he used to teach. But what I've not seen, and hopefully, I will come across some sort of records, and perhaps some of these are part of the Municipal Archives records, actual lesson plans, but that I haven't come across as yet.
ERS, how was this building spared the advances of progress that facetiously for so long?
That's another great question. So when I started my research, I thought, because the way the news emerged, that the school had started, that it was reconstruction year about 1870. Not realizing that the address had changed and the number of the school had changed, and indeed it went back. So it gained like 17 more years. So it's about 1853. But then you stand in front of it and you look at the windows and you look at the sketches, the original sketches, and they're the same windows. And I think that it survived partially because the Board of Ed did not sell it as it said it was going to do in 1894. It just passed it on to another city agency. The Department of Transportation has had it since the 1930s. And then in between it being a school and Department of Sanitation, it was a headquarters for Civil War veterans, specifically the Zouaves, the fire Zouaves, that they were often recruited from the city's fire department. And because of its relatively passive use, I think that may have contributed to it's not really changing very much in the fact that the windows that you're looking at today appear to be the original windows. I mean, they look like stained glass, but they're just stained with whatever stains New York windows. But there are these like little tiny, square panes, like 16 over 16 sash windows. And that's kind of amazing. So that's the only thing I can kind of really chalk it up to, how it survived, by the fact that it wasn't sold, and it didn't really transfer its usage to any kind of really aggressive activity. I think basically when it was part of under the Department of Sanitation, it was called a section station, which was basically a place for people working, sanitation workers in the area, to have lunch breaks, sort of a respite between their shifts, and that sort of thing. So it's a very passive use that doesn't really alter the building that much. So
yes, you're also asked, did the school have an all Black faculty?
Yes. So these schools were relegated to Black students and Black teachers. And it caused, it's just a big deal of the problem when they, in 1884, after Grover Cleveland signs the bill closing most of the colored schools, except with the exception of 2, to absorb them into the general system, it created problems because there's still discrimination. So the Black teachers are facing issues of salaries. They've been teaching for just as long as a lot of the white teachers in the other schools that they're being absorbed into, but because of seniority, they're going to be, at the back. So it created a lot of issues. But yes, these were Black educators. It was often, I should mention, Sarah Garnett, and a lot of sources, this gets repeated over and over and over again, that she was the first Black female teacher, principal in New York City when she was hired in 1863. And that I discovered not to be the case. She actually replaced Charlotte Smith, who was a Black female principal. And I don't know that Charlotte Smith was the first either, but we do know that she was identified as the principal, but she died and she needed to be replaced. And Garnett, who had been a principal in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn was a separate city at the time, came to New York, which was Manhattan, and replaced her. But she was not the first in the system. But she didn't need to be. She has so many other great, qualifications that for which her praises are duly sung.
And Phyllis asks, what can individuals do to get landmark status?
Another great question. So what's happened over the past several months, I filed with Landmarks 4 years ago, and Landmarks takes care of all 5 boroughs. It's not just local. So, there's always a backlog. But as I started presenting this, 3 years later, there's been a rash of letters of support, which have been really great. So doing things like these talks for the community board, for block associations, and public talks and even private talks, people have been really excited by this history and have written letters of support to Landmarks to register, their sentiments that they feel that the school, deserves to be protected with landmark designation. And I think, such things as, even other schools recognizing that don't have a direct affiliation with Sarah Garnett and renaming themselves the Sarah Garnett School, I think that's a testament to how significant the individuals who were connected to this school were, in what high esteem they were held. So that's what people can do. You can write letters. I think that does have some weight. It's a slow process. It's already been a slow process, but I think it's not for naught. I think right now the most powerful strategy for this is spreading the word. that this is a place that exists, and in fact, the building itself still exists, and that's, to keep spreading the word is a way of monopolizing the conversation to some degree.
And I think you touched a little bit on Maggie's question already. Lisa just come to this, an excellent presentation, and wondered if you had plans on publishing this research.
Some of it is, I started with, it's in my book, and that's how I got started. So in my book, there's, the school is featured, as are, Sarah Garnett and Imogen Howard and some of the graduates. But I didn't, it was kind of accidentally, I kind of backtracked to see where they were going with it. And I realized I already had, over 5,000 words in my notes. So I'm involved in, the Biographers International organization. So I'm focused on the interest of biography. And I realized that, this is a perfect place for it. All of these individuals, teachers and students and visitors, have these stories that I have decided I'm going to pursue more. So I think, yes, that's the long answer to the short soundbite is yes.
I think you also touched on Heidi's question about who owns the building.
Department of Sanitation. So it's city owned by the Department of Sanitation is the administrates the building.
I think you touched on this as well, but has the building been used for anything else, or has it just stood empty?
It was used up until, as I understand from neighbors on the block, until about 5 or 6 years ago, as a section station of Department of Sanitation. So right now it's still Department of Sanitation's, but it's not being used. So right now it's languishing, and we know, as in New York, things that just sit are subject to, the elements, whether they're natural elements or, societal elements that are not necessarily to that site's advantage. But it's almost a gift because knowing what we know now about what the building represented and the fact that it's endured all of this time, it's a monument in itself, and I think it's appropriate that it be that it receive designation that appreciates it as such.
Right. Where can someone find an example of a letter of support that they can use to advocate for their landmark status?
You could go online, but you don't have to write a long letter. You can, no longer than one page, just saying, you've heard so much about the school and you think that it deserves to be landmarked, and maybe, the process can be expedited. There's no typical amount of time that it takes to review a process because it depends on the site. But there was another building, another colored school, number 3 in Brooklyn, that was landmarked in 1998. So that's over 20 years ago. So it was a different city, but it's the same sort of backstory. So it's, it would be nice. It's not like they have to relearn how to ride a bicycle. It's a very familiar story with some very distinctive details, but I think this is a fairly inordinate amount of time that it's taken, which is not to say that there's not a reason for it. But I think it's good. I think landmarks commissioners appreciate hearing from the public to know that they're aware of sites that they think are important to the narrative of New York City's history.
And I have institutions that were around when the school was, they give an example of Abyssinian Baptist Church got involved in this campaign.
Not as yet, but it's rather young. So I'm doing this sort of thing, and there might be people behind one of those little Hollywood squares there who are from some of those organizations. So the process is unrolling. So I think that's happening. What organizations though have responded are like the local community board, the local city council, the Manhattan borough historian, the direct neighbors, people, block associations, and co-op boards that are right on the block have written letters. So, and that's very important because it's not just letters coming from afar, but neighbors who are like people who are stakeholders who are really excited by having this history that's part of their neighborhood history. So I think, that's coming, some of the wider reaching organizations like church groups and will still be coming in. People are still, writing letters.
I want to ask, is the brick facing the building later?
Yes. So one of the images that I showed, there was a darker image. That was when it was brick exposed. And then the tax photo that I showed where it looks white, that's from about 1940. So probably sometime in the 30s when Department of Sanitation took it over, they covered the brick with some sort of white veneer, looks yellow veneer. So that's later.
How old did the daughter live to? Raul asks.
Oh, that's she was born from she was Serena Tompkins. So she was born about 1851. She dies in I don't have this the file in front of me. I think it was 1898. And she was most of her life appears to have remained in Brooklyn. And she was an organist and a pianist. So she comes up in actually quite a number of news articles at various receptions and church benefits in Brooklyn. But she's also listed at a conference in Boston with her mother, Sarah Garnett. It's a teachers' conference, and their addresses are given as 128 West 17th Street. It's the school's address. So whether or not she was actually affiliated with the school or if they just put down that address as an affiliation for their presence at the conference, I don't know. But a lot of sources say that Garnett had two sons before she was widowed by Tompkins, two sons that did not live into adulthood. And I don't know if that's so or not. And I've never seen a mention of the daughter. But I backtracked, and she does appear on census records.
Okay. We also had a question about can you give us some context of school taxes and mandatory education at the time?
Mandatory education, the schools were separate by definition. So you had public schools, but within the public school system, you had separate colored schools. And that had been since they were first the African free schools from 1787 until 1834, when the Public School Society took over. And then they were changed, the names were changed and others were added that became known as colored schools.
Okay, and there was a question, so Sarah might have had only one child from Raul.
So I only know, I was only able to find a death certificate for Serena, Sarah's child, her daughter. Other secondary sources that I've seen online kind of repeat over and over that she had two children who did not survive adulthood. I think I've seen that it was two sons, but I've only come across in records, on census records, any suggestion of any other, no other suggestions of any other children other than Serena, the daughter.
I just want to revisit ER's comment. She mentioned that in Baltimore, our colored school 103 is the Henry Highland Garnet School, and it is about to be restored and repurposed. And its most famous alum is Thurgood Marshall. And maybe she could put you in together with the leader of that project. Hopefully share the story of the Garnets.
Yes, and it's the story of the Garnets is far and wide.
I think that's the last of our questions. I want to thank everyone for coming, everyone for being patient as we tackled some technical difficulties. Thank you for sticking with us to the end, and thank you for Eric for being so patient. And thank you for being here to share all your great knowledge about the city. Anything you'd want to say before we go?
No, I thank you again for coming, all of you. I can't see all of you, but I don't know how many you are, but thank you all, one and all. But thank you. And when you're shopping at Housing Works across the street on 17th Street one day, look across the street and you'll see it. Because for years I passed by, and if you blink, you miss it. But it's there.
Okay, and yes, this will be recorded. It will be an edited version and made available on our YouTube channel. Again, thank you all for being here. And we have a few other events, so please stay tuned to our site. We have an upcoming event featuring our Central Park original designs that's going to be up for display on later this month. So anyway, thank you for coming with us today. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Boo.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone.
Take care. Happy lunch.